you've emailed me or you've texted me or sent a message to me on Facebook that you signed up for this class and you'd either heard of this speech but never read it, or you'd never really even heard of it and never read it, and that now you've read it and oh my God. Yeah, oh my God. It's an incredible speech. And I think, John, you emailed me yesterday and you said, I can understand why I did not read this, or we didn't talk about this in my Southern high school in the 50s or whatever it was, you know? No, if you went to school anytime before the last 15 minutes in this nation's history, you probably did not read this, or you were not taught this in history class. This is just one of those situations where history is taught by the people who write it. What counts as history is filtered through the experience of the people who write it and who teach it. And so in this country, that's predominantly been white people, and it's been white men. So that's why we don't hear a lot of women's stories. We don't hear a lot of stories from Black people or indigenous people or other people of color, because that's not who's recorded the history, and that's not who's taught it for the bulk of our history. So this piece, so many other things are part of what those of us who want to have a more accurate, more fully filled out history of this country, we have to give ourselves to lectures, to speeches and pieces of writing and things like this, because these things represent the gaps in most of our educations and in most of our understandings of our own country. So anyway, hi, Anne, good to see you. Let me give you a little bit of historical context on Frederick Douglass. He's very famous. Most people have heard of him, and sort of a little bit of bio on him, and also some historical context for this particular speech. This speech does not happen in a vacuum. He didn't write it and then put it in a box and then it gets published much later. It comes out, he gives it at a very specific time in 1852. And then there's an important context to understand in terms of why it landed the way it did. And he continued to give this speech with some edits and for the next several years. But this version is the one that is the most famous. Frederick Douglass is born, he lived through most of the 19th century. His dates are 1818 to 1895. So his lifespan covered most of the 19th century. And he's born in Maryland, in Talbot County, Maryland, into slavery. So he himself was a slave, born into slavery. And he became one of the most influential human rights activists of the 19th century in this country, and particularly around issues of abolition, the abolition of slavery, and women's rights. He attended the Seneca Falls Convention, which was one of the first organized movements for women's suffrage and women's rights. And he was at that meeting. So he was what today would be called a radical progressive type. And we'll come back to that in a minute. So he became internationally known as a statesman, as an orator, as an editor. He edited himself several newspapers that he started and edited. He was a writer, all of that. So his lectures and articles and things are on a variety of issues around civil rights and gender and race. And I think if you manage to get through this, you see that his ideas and his ideas very much resonate still today. They are very resonant today as we watch television, as many of us ourselves go out and protest the injustices that we see still happening in the Black community and then the communities of people of color. He began his public speaking career aligned with what's called the Garrisonian abolitionists. Garrison. These are the abolitionists that were in the school of thought of William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison was lived in Boston, and he was a newspaper editor. His paper, I think, was called The Liberator. And he advocated, I mean, in his abolitionist work, it was a nonviolent, non-political, it was politically neutral, I mean, in terms of political parties and stuff, sort of activism and movement for abolition. And he had a huge following. And so Douglass began his work as an activist and as a speaker, narrating his own experiences as a slave who eventually got his freedom. And so this is very interesting because Douglass, obviously, as a Black man who had been a slave, his narrative is particularly poignant in this. And it parallels, some of you may be familiar with the Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah Grimke. They also were in that Garrison school of thought, and they were women in the South, in North Carolina or South Carolina, and had owned slaves and were a slave owning family. And they came to renounce that and to set the slaves free. And when they found out their brother had sired mixed race children with one of the slaves that they owned, they saw to it that those children were educated and all of that. And so they went on this tour too. And so, and what they did was they told stories about slave owning families, including their own. So when Douglass begins to speak about his own experience as a slave and what he himself witnessed and what he saw his family witness and what his fellow slaves witnessed, and he gave names. He gave the names of the owners and the people who beat the slaves and who whipped them and flayed them and did the horrible things. And he was very graphic about it, and he gave names. The Grimke sisters did too. And as Southern women who themselves had owned, their families had owned slaves, and they grew up with slaves, and they saw it with their own eyes, and they gave names. This ended up being really powerful and poignant because it cut through some of the mythology that we still have about slavery. Well, it wasn't that bad. The masters were, many of them, some of them were really bad, but mostly they were benevolent and good to their slaves. No, they weren't. No, they weren't. And even if they were, it's still not okay. You still cannot own other people and it be okay. This is chattel slavery. This is not the slavery that existed in the Roman Empire. This is not the slavery that that other empires around the world have practiced, where people were turned to slaves because they were captured in war or because they were indebted, and they could buy their slavery. They could buy their freedom. They could work off their freedom. They could do. This is not what this was. This was chattel slavery, where men, women, and children and infants were bought and sold along with cows, horses, and swine. And they were listed in terms of livestock, property holdings. So there's this mythology around the slave master and the antebellum times of Magnolia and beautiful plantations and all of that. Douglass's speeches from his own experience as a slave, the Grimke sisters, other people from the South who began to tell the truth about slavery and its impact and what good white Christian people were doing to other human beings, that's what really sharpened the point of the abolitionist movement. And it's important to understand that context, because it's important to understand how hard it is to go against a reigning mythology about something, particularly mythology that the majority finds comforting. And we'll come back to that because he hits it in this speech. So anyway, he published, he was a very popular speaker, and he published his first memoir. I think he published 3 different memoirs. A narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, American slave. That was in 1845. And that's when he really began telling these harrowing stories of his life as a child, his childhood as a slave. And he, for the first time, revealed actual locations and actual names and all that. He had the receipts, as people like to say today. He went on tours to support that book and some of his other writings, mostly to the UK, to Great Britain. Came back to the United States, settled mostly in Rochester, New York, and started a number of newspapers. One's called the North Star, another one, the Douglass Monthly. There were, I think, 4 of them. And so he had these newspapers. He then sort of shifted some of his tactics away from the Garrison approach, which was non-political and non-violent, and began to endorse something a little different. He was a supporter of John Brown, the anti-slavery activist who used violence, the Harper's Ferry episode with him. So Douglass in his own journey went on a journey with regard to violence and the use of it. And he has some things to say in the speech, which we will get to in a moment, about the limits of civility and forbearance when it comes to fighting tyranny and fighting oppression. That there's, in short, it's worthwhile to be civil, to remonstrate, to sit down and try to have a conversation and be reasonable. And at a certain point, that's not going to work anymore. At a certain point, you can't be expected to stay calm about your own oppression. And in those moments, some form of agitation or violence is perhaps called for, or at least understandable. And you can't hold it against the people who are oppressed, they've got a foot on their neck, or in the case of our recent things, they've got an officer's knee on their neck. You can't expect that they're going to stay civil and reasonable and calm and all that. We'll get to those passages. After President Lincoln made emancipation of slaves part of the goal of the Union in Civil War, Douglass gave his support to the Republican Party. Lincoln was a member of the Republican Party at the time. He was very active in recruiting African-American soldiers for the Union Army. 2 of his own sons went and fought in the Union Army. After the Civil War and slaves were freed and the abolitionist movement was no longer necessary, his public role sort of changed, and he continued to push for African-American equality because, of course, it wasn't fixed with the Civil War. But his methods changed a little bit. He also jumped over into the women's suffrage challenge and pushing for that. He moved to DC in the 1870s, and then until he died for the next 25 years, he held a number of positions in the federal government under several different administrations. He had a couple of different positions to Haiti, like consul and minister to Haiti in the 1880s and 90s. He served as a bank president for a freedmen's bank, which was a bank initially dedicated to help freed slaves gain financial solvency. All this time, he kept a very active speaking schedule and remained a leading human rights activist until his death. Even on the day that he died in February of 1895, he had given a speech that morning at a rally in Washington, D.C. So until the day he died, he was he was busy. He's just on the road. He's busy doing his work. So this speech was given in 1852 on July the 5th, 1852, as an address. He gave it in Rochester, New York, and he gave it to the Ladies Anti-Slavery Society there. He had been invited to give that speech. And so he gave it. And as I said, he gave this a version of this speech with some edits and some changes a number of times in the years afterward. As the situation in the country changed, as different movements came up, and as the country seemed headed towards civil war, and then after the Civil War. And so he kept coming back to this theme, and this speech changed in his hands. But this is the version that mostly is remembered and commemorated. Ken, you just commented about, and several of you sent me this on Facebook, the NPR recently ran a video of several young descendants of Frederick Douglass reading parts of this speech and discussing it. I think Lorraine Wolf, you sent me that. A couple of you sent me that. So all you have to do is Google that, Frederick Douglass descendants, and then the speech, and you'll get it. It's really powerful. It's an amazing thing. So avail yourself of that if you haven't already. There's a couple of things that set the context for this speech, and I want to highlight those. One is what's called the Compromise of 1850, which included the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 was a package of about 5 different bills that were passed into law by the United States Congress in September of 1850. And it helped kind of diffuse a political confrontation between slave states and free states, particularly on the status of the territories that were acquired in the Mexican-American War. And so the compromise ended up setting Texas's, the state of Texas, its borders. It addressed California. It addressed fugitive slave issues and a few other things. So under the compromise, Texas ended up surrendering its claim to what's present day New Mexico in exchange for the United States would take on some of Texas's public debt. California was admitted in as a free state, while the remaining areas of the territories acquired in the Mexican-American War, like parts of what was then called New Mexico Territory and Utah Territory, they were going to be allowed to decide via popular sovereignty if they were going to be slave states or free states. So the people there living in those territories would get to decide based on consensus through popular sovereignty. So also included in this compromise was the Fugitive Slave Act. So this is another thing to note. This was passed as part of this compromise. And basically it was a really controversial element of this compromise, and it heightened fears that people had in the North about a slave power conspiracy, because basically it enlisted the North in participating in Southern slavery. If slaves escaped their owners in the South and made their way through Underground Railroad or any other kind of way to the North, Northern people were legally required now to hand them over back to their Southern owners, and could be imprisoned, fined, all that if they didn't. And judges who in courts of law who did not comply with that risked losing their judgeships. They were paid extra. They were incentivized, we'll say. Douglass says they were bribed to turn back fugitive slaves. And so it really made the North and everyone who lived there complicit in the practice of slavery. It didn't, it by law demanded that they return slaves who had escaped slavery, return them back. And a lot of abolitionists like Douglass and others nicknamed it the Bloodhound Bill. They called it the Bloodhound Bill because they used dogs, those bloodhound dogs, to track down runaway slaves. This is the origins, a large part of the origins of policing. modern day policing. Police forces began here as slave patrols. So when we see fighting in the streets today and protests in the streets, and you see hashtag defund the police, there is a long history of enmity between police forces and the Black community in this country. A long history, and it is not a pretty history. It is a bloody, awful history of oppression. So it's important to know that. And that's not saying that police officers today are slave patrol. That we're not saying that. It's important to understand the history of these things and to fill that history out so that we have a fuller understanding and a fuller knowledge. When we know better, we can do better. So anyway, Fugitive Slave Act. Another piece of legislation that happened right 2 years after this speech was given is the Kansas Nebraska Act of 1854. And it was an act that created the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. And they too were going to be given the opportunity through popular sovereignty to determine if they were free or slave states. It basically repealed the Missouri Compromise, which had been signed into law back in 1820, and it had admitted Maine, the state of Maine, as a free state, and Missouri as a slave state, so that it kept the balance between the North and the South. Each of them got an additional state. Because see, here's the challenge. As the country was expanding westward and taking over those territories, the North, people who were against slavery wanted those new territories and new states to come in as free states. And then the Southerners wanted those to come in as slaveholding states. So there was all this fighting back and forth and negotiating. And so as the country expands westward and takes over more territories, this conversation has to be had over and over and over again. And it's in that Missouri Compromise that the 3630 latitude, longitude lines had been established, that no state north of that could be a slaveholding state. And so, the Kansas Nebraska Act sort of set aside the Missouri Compromise and repealed it effectively. Eventually, both Kansas and Nebraska was further north, so it was already expected to be a northern state, a free state, but Kansas was right there close, and it eventually came in as a free state too, but not after a lot of fighting and bloodshed. And immediately everybody rushed to the Kansas territory to try to lobby the popular people, to the people who were living there, to be a free state or a slave state or whatever. So that happened 2 years later after this speech. And then one more piece to sort of set the context. The publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Life Among the Lowly. This was a novel published by the American author, white woman, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Many of you have read it. It's a very famous novel. It was published in 1852, the year he gave this speech. And it had a profound impact on the attitudes that white Americans had towards slavery and to African Americans. It's most historians will say that it helped set the stage for the Civil War. All these things together that I just mentioned to you, they help set the stage. The country is moving slowly toward ever increasing hostility, ever increasing inability to compromise on this. That the point is being sharpened, and it is dividing the country on these issues, and it eventually ends up in the Civil War. So this Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Stowe was a teacher at the Hartford Female Seminary, and she was an active abolitionist. And her novel featured this character named Uncle Tom, and he was a sort of long-suffering Black slave, and the story revolves around him and the people that he knows and the other characters that are in the novel. It is kind of a sentimental novel. It depicts the reality of slavery, but it also kind of asserts that Christian love can overcome all these things, and it's a little bit sentimental. It was the best-selling novel of the 19th century and the second best-selling book of that century. The best-selling was the Bible, so it was second only to the Bible during that time. And so it's really credited with helping the cause of the abolitionists in the 1850s. Unfortunately, I mean, some of us now living in the 20th century, 21st century, it doesn't have the sort of high standing that it did then, because the novel also helps to perpetuate certain stereotypes about Black people. The sort of dutiful, Uncle Tom is the dutiful, long-suffering servant who's faithful to his white master or mistress. Also, like the mammy stereotype that we saw in the movie Gone with the Wind, and that we've seen uproars about with Aunt Jemima on the syrup, that sort of stereotype of the Black woman, the pickaninny stereotype of little Black children that you saw in series like Amos and Andy and Little Rascals, and in some of the minstrel shows at the turn of the century. So the novel is problematic in many ways, and the negative associations with it have perhaps dominated our time. But it's important to see what it did in its time in terms of really opening up the conversation and contributing to the shift in perspective and contributing to this issue being brought to a point even more. It was a vital anti-slavery tool. So that kind of gives you a little bit of the history and sets the context. Douglass is speaking at a very particular moment, and this speech comes at a particular moment when things are starting to roil, things are starting to not be manageable any longer in the way that the country had been managed. Sorry, that's my dog. Hush. Sorry. Okay, let's look at the introduction. He gives us the first, and I printed it out, and it's not going to match up with whatever you printed out, and that's okay. I'm just going to read some passages, and I'll, if you're following along with your own printout, I'll give you kind of a, the paragraph that begins with this sentence or whatever, so you can find your way. But I'll read out some passages so that if you don't have it in front of you or it's too cumbersome, you can still follow along. Hold on. I'm going to let my dogs out of this room. Sorry. Okay, so what we see here in the first three, yeah, Sharon says, hi, Cooper and Seven, those are my dogs. What we see him doing here, now we could spend, if we were in a speech and debate class, if we were doing a class in rhetoric, we would approach this speech in a very different way. It is a masterful piece of oration. The way he structures it, the way, I mean, down to the use of certain words, it's just really an astonishing and wonderful piece. And so there's a whole other way to look at this speech if you're interested in it from that perspective. This introduction is one of those examples, because here he stands up and he says, the first line, "He who could address this audience without a quailing sensation has stronger nerves than I have. I do not remember ever to have appeared as a speaker before any assembly more shrinkingly nor with greater distrust of my ability than I do to this day." He talks about his limited powers of speech. He talks about most of his public meetings have been in country schoolhouses there at the end of that first paragraph. But then in the next paragraph, he says, it's true, I have often had the privilege to speak in this beautiful hall. It's called the Corinthian. It was this new facility. The fact is, the distance between this platform and the slave plantation from which I escaped is considerable. He goes on and says, I evince no elaborate preparation nor grace my speech with any high-sounding exordium. Now, I mean, this is the 1850s, so their vocabulary is a little bit different from ours. But, you know, he puts the term exordium in a sentence where he's talking about how he doesn't have any grace in his speech. So this is a very important introduction because he's walking a tightrope between humility, where he's acknowledging that this is a very important holiday in this nation's history, and in this nation's conscience, and in its how it thinks about itself, and that here are these incredible people and in this incredible place, and so he's humbled to be there. But he's not just going to be humble. He's also going to assert his authority to be there, and he has a right to be there. And he's a really sophisticated man. He, against all odds, with all the odds against him, he has become an incredibly sophisticated, skilled, intelligent, educated, masterful thinker, writer, and speaker who used to be a slave. So he's walking this very fine line, a tightrope there of humility, but also, I have authority to speak on this, and you're going to hear me. I'm not leaving out of here until you hear me. So it's a wonderful sort of rhetorical strategy. We'll see Dr. King use something similar in a couple of weeks when we come back to the letter from a Birmingham jail. Another thing to notice on these first few paragraphs, and 1, 2, 3, the fourth paragraph down, his use of the term your country, your founders, your forefathers, your country. This is your holiday. He doesn't say our holiday, my holiday. He does say fellow citizens, but he uses the term your. This is a deliberate rhetorical device. I see it today in some of the Black Lives Matter activists and in some of the indigenous community activists that I follow on social media, and I keep up with them just to hear their narratives and hear their stories and not be so white-centered, but to hear other perspectives and narratives. They will say, your president, your country, your state. You know, they use this type of language as a way to distance themselves from whatever it is that is yours that they're talking about. So he says, it's the birthday of your national independence, your political freedom. This to you is what the Passover was to the emancipated people of God. It carries your minds. It's the act of your great deliverance, your national life, your nation. He goes on with this for several pages and finally comes to a conclusion with it. At the end of, in my printout, it's page 7. It's a paragraph that begins with, but such is not the state of the case. I say it with a sad sense of the disparity between us. I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must mourn. So here we see why he's using this language, and he's making it very clear. This is your holiday. It's not mine. It's yours. And so this is another one of those rhetorical devices. He's very deliberately using this type of language to make a very specific point. Leslie asked, where did he get his education? He's largely self-taught. He had tutors and others, but he is largely self-taught. Sydney, you're saying your version is very different. There are different versions of this speech on the internet. So I sent the link to the Women's Institute of the one to use. I don't know if that somehow didn't get translated or whatever. It may be an abbreviated or an abridged version. There are several abridged versions. Let me get out of some of these. So let's talk about his view of the founders. That's another very important piece. You might have expected him to have a negative view of the founders. George Washington owned slaves. Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. Something like 12 or 14 of the presidents so far of the United States of America, of the 45 that we've had, 12 or 14 of them owned slaves, several of them while they were in office. And of course, Thomas Jefferson's story is well known with, with Sally Hemings, and he had children with his slaves and all of that. So there are a lot of folks today, people are considering whether they want to pull down the Jefferson Memorial, whether they want to take down the statues of Washington. And we're having this moment in our country where people are wanting to tear down statues. Douglass here takes a positive view of the founders. Not that they were perfect men. He mentions Washington's slaves. He mentions that they're not perfect men. They have problems. They didn't fully actualize their own principles. And yet he extols them as men to be admired. Let's look at a few passages. He talks about the reformer, the patriot, and the founder, and that the patriot and the founder today in his time could take heart from the fact that the country's only about 75, 76 years old when he's giving this speech. It's a young country. Its deep grooves have not yet been set. There's still time for it to really drastically change its course and move away from slavery, move away from that being its founding economic institution. It's not so set in stone just yet, so that the patriot and the reformer can take heart in that. He talks about, let's see, this is about 6 paragraphs in, a paragraph that begins with, but your fathers who had not adopted, that's the beginning of the paragraph. If you skip a few lines down, they went so far in their excitement as to pronounce the measures of government under the British unjust, unreasonable, and oppressive, and altogether such as ought not to be quietly submitted to. I scarcely need say, fellow citizens, that my opinion of those measures fully accords with that of your fathers. This is his thesis statement in this part of the speech, where he spends several pages here talking about the founders. He agrees with them. Oppression, injustice, and tyranny is not to be quietly submitted to. This country was founded via armed revolution against the British in order to throw off tyranny and oppression. And he agrees with that. He agrees with those principles. Injustice, unreasonableness, and tyranny is not to be silently tolerated. There's a time past which you don't tolerate that. You fight. In this case, you stage a revolution, and it was an armed revolution. And yes, you end up destroying property. You throw tea into the harbor. You have a war. This country was founded on armed revolution on principles of justice, freedom, equality, anti-tyranny, and the rule of law and human dignity. And so from right here, he says, I don't need to tell you, I agree with these principles. And so he's not only making a statement about the history of the country, he's making a statement about his current, present 1852, the present time for him. These principles are as true now as they were on July the 4th. Those men fought for these principles, and they fought to overthrow oppression, as we must do today. That's the implicit thing that he's already starting to say. He's much more explicit about it later in this speech. 2 paragraphs from there. This is the paragraph beginning with feeling themselves harshly and unjustly treated. So if you're following along in your own text, feeling themselves harshly and unjustly treated by the home government, which is the British, your fathers, like men of honesty and men of spirit, earnestly sought redress. They petitioned and remonstrated. They did so in a decorous, respectful, and loyal manner. Their conduct was wholly unexceptionable. This, however, did not answer the purpose. They saw themselves treated with sovereign indifference, coldness, and scorn, yet they persevered. They were not the men to look back. This is one of several places, a few places in here where he points to the limits of civility. And this is a conversation that we in this country are having right now and have had it in the last few months since George Floyd's murder in the street by a police officer. At what point do you stop being peaceful? There are limits to civility. There are limits to respectability. Dr. King talked about it. Dr. King, and we'll get to him in 2 weeks, but Dr. King went on his own journey, committed to passive nonviolent resistance. And most of his civil rights activism was deeply seated and rooted in that tradition, which he got from Gandhi and he got from his own Christian religion. Toward the end of his life, though, if you read his speeches, he was coming to shift his view a little bit. That after a certain point, you're not going to be able to sit down and have reasonable conversations with those who hold power. You have to force them to give up power. And it may end up being not as nonviolent as you would have hoped. He has a theological reason for this, that he loved the Niebuhr brothers theologically, and it really depends on if you have a view that people are basically good, or if you have with a few problematic tendencies, or if that people are basically sinful and with a strong propensity toward evil and must be saved by a God who can redeem them from their fallenness. He says that he underestimated human evil, and that in cases of human evil, passive nonviolent resistance may not get it done. And how long can you expect people who are oppressed to endure that in the name of passive nonviolence? You can't expect that. And so Douglass here is speaking this. And this, if you read any civil rights activists, they wrestle with this at some point. They have to deal with this. At what point, what's our limit? When you look at the footage of them, during the Selma March and some of the other activism that Dr. King and them did, when you see them the police officers sicking the dogs on people and blowing the fire hoses on people, including children. There were hundreds of children, teenagers, 12-year-olds, 10-year-olds in the streets during that march, and they got arrested. I posted something today on my Facebook page, my personal page, about the Leesburg Girls. These were teenage girls, middle school, 13, 14, 15 years old, doing the work, out marching, and they got arrested and thrown into a pen, a detention center out in the woods in Leesburg, Georgia, for something like a month and a half. Their parents didn't know where they were. Nobody knew where they were. And just, these were children. And they're all dressed respectively. You look at some of those footage of fire hoses being blown on people. They're wearing their Sunday clothes. They're being respectful. They're being peaceful. But it doesn't matter. They got blasted. They got dogs sicked on them. We've seen this here in recent weeks. Peaceful protests, peaceful people getting shot with rubber bullets, getting stuff thrown on them. So this is a perennial conversation in activism. And it comes up again and again. And so here, Douglass is mentioning it. And he's extolling the founding fathers. They did not do what India did. India threw off British colonization largely through passive nonviolent resistance. This country overthrew British colonization with a revolutionary war. They went to war over it. They shot people. They went to war, armed conflict. And these are the men that we extol on the 4th of July for their commitment. Now, what he points out, and he spends a couple pages here doing it, is that at the time, they were considered terrorists. They were considered rebels. They were not extolled. They were considered crazy people, like what we would today call terrorists. To go against the British crown and to take up your deer rifles and your squirrel hunting guns, and just form this guerrilla militia and go against the British army, you're nuts. And you're a colonial power. They own you. You shouldn't rebel against that. These guys were not widely lauded by their contemporaries. Now they are. He's extolling the founders on the 4th of July, and he's making sure that he does it in a way that brings it to the present. Much like the founders were not celebrated during their time, they were still right. They were considered terrorists and rebel rousers and mischief makers and agitators, and were made fun of and put down and called dangerous men, but they were right. And they knew they were right. They knew that justice and tyranny is not to be tolerated. They tried to negotiate. They tried to get the king to listen to them. They tried civil means of getting their needs met and getting their concerns addressed, and it fell on cold ears. So they staged an armed revolution. Likewise, the abolitionists in 1852 are considered mischief makers, troublemakers, rebels. They're not following the rule of law. They're disrupting order and all those things. But they're right, he's saying. That's part of his argument. So he's really crafting this whole section of the speech where he talks about the founders. He's extolling them, but he's also using them as a mirror, as a first version 1.0 of this person in America who will not tolerate tyranny, will not tolerate injustice for very long, will bring it to attention, try to sit down, try to work something out, but at a certain point, they're going to claim it for themselves. And if they have to go to war over it, they will. It's a very interesting and powerful rhetorical device. Oppression makes a wise man mad. Your fathers were wise men. And if they did not go mad, they became restive under this treatment. They felt themselves the victims of grievous wrongs, wholly incurable in their colonial capacity. With brave men, there is always a remedy for oppression. Just here, the idea of a total separation of the colonies from the crown was born. That was the solution. We're breaking free. We're not going to be under this tyranny anymore. We're breaking free. That's what we're doing. It was a startling idea, much more so than we, at this distance of time, regard it. It's just normal for us. We say, oh yeah, they fought the British, fought the British, yay. Really? I mean, we don't totally get what that really meant and the impact of that. The timid and the prudent of that day were, of course, shocked and alarmed by it. Same as today. The prudent are always shocked by the violence, by the stridency of those who are suffering injustice. So this lauding of the founders, he aligns himself with them in terms of their ideals and their principles and their values. And he also aligns himself with the radical nature of their actions. To call for the abolition of slavery in 1852, certainly more and more people were coming around to that view. But this country still went into a civil war over it. This country fought itself over this issue of slavery. Now, if you're born and raised in the South, like I am, I'm born and raised in Louisiana in the 60s and 70s. I was taught that the Civil War was over states' rights. And it was over states' rights. States' rights to what? To own slaves. It was over the states' rights to own slaves. If you read the Articles of Secession, where all those southern states seceded from the Union, every one of them mentions in paragraph after paragraph that the right to own slaves is their fundamental right, and they will not stay in a union that doesn't honor that right of the states. So, but to say, oh, it wasn't over slavery, it was over the states, that's a way of covering over and mythologizing. This country went to war over this. So we forget the radical nature of it. We forget the radical nature of the founders, and we forget the radical nature of the abolitionists and what they were up against. It was just radical. It's a very different way of living and thinking. And so he's bringing that radical nature of the founders up into his focus. He then moves into a section about the present, that there's no point there's really no right. People don't have a right to wax nostalgic about the past without applying those same principles that animated the founders in the past, applying those same principles to the present. So he starts this, I don't know, about the first third, maybe to the halfway point of the speech. It's after that little poetic stanza there. It's a paragraph that says, "We have to do with the past." It's a paragraph beginning with those words. "We have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and to the future. To all inspiring motives, to noble deeds which can be gained from the past, we are welcome. But now is the time, the important time. Your fathers have lived, died, and have done their work, and have done much of it well. You live and must die, and you must do your work. You have no right to enjoy a child's share in the labor of your fathers unless your children are to be blessed by your labors. You have no right to wear out and waste the hard-earned fame of your fathers to cover your indolence." So he's bringing it to the present. What are you going to do now? These are the principles that founded your country. These are the principles that you celebrate on this day, on the 4th of July. How are you living them out now? What work are you doing now in the present to live out those principles? He goes on another paragraph down. "Fellow citizens, pardon me, allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? Would to God that an affirmative answer could be truthfully returned. I wish I could say yes." Next paragraph, "But such is not the case. I say with a sad sense of disparity between us, I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us." And we've already read that paragraph because we read it a moment ago. He says, the 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. And so pointing out, you can celebrate all you want, but this is not my holiday. And this is not Black people's holiday. They're still owned. They're still being sold on the block. Little children are still being ripped from their mother's breast and sold like baby pigs and calves. They're still being whipped down the roads. When they're being caught after having risked their lives for their freedom, and they're caught up in the north, they're herded back down to the south, being, with chains on a walking for hundreds and hundreds of miles, exhausted, being whipped and beaten, some of them carrying children on the breast, many of them being separated from their families, from their parents, from their husbands and wives, from their children torn out of and they're whipped and beaten and flayed and flogged and lynched the whole time and branded like cattle. This is not our 4th of July. Y'all have fun, pop some fireworks. This isn't for us. We got nothing. This isn't our country. This is your holiday. This isn't ours. This is a very interesting thing. And it's something that those of us who are white or who pass as white and who are committed to doing anti-racist work, this is what is commonly called white centering. White centering narratives. White centering is when you take holidays like the 4th of July, Thanksgiving, any of these holidays, and it centers the white experience and the white narrative about those holidays. We're centering the white experience and the white narrative of that holiday in a way that either minimizes or outright erases the experiences of other people, mostly Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color, of that same thing. Thanksgiving is a perfect example. White people tend to celebrate it as a time of Thanksgiving and family and cooperation, and we sat down with the Native Americans and we had dinner and all that, had a fine meal. That's not really how the Native Americans experience it. That's not how Native Americans have experienced the founding of this country. We celebrate this country. I mean, if a Native American was giving this speech instead of Frederick Douglass, it would be a different speech. It would tell a different story, but a lot of the fire and a lot of the prophetic nature of it would be the same. You all came over here and you killed us. We've lived here for thousands of years before y'all ever came. And it was a genocide. You celebrate the founding of your country, but it was a genocide for us. It's not something we celebrate. And Indigenous people today are still trying to fight for their rights in this country, still have their lands taken over, still have all their treaties violated all the time. So this is something to be aware of for those of us who are white and who are committed to anti-racist work, to pay attention to white centering. When narratives about our country, about certain holidays, about certain big public events, when the only experience being narrated is the white one, and then it's assumed to be universal, because in a country of white superiority, the white experience is considered the human experience, the universal human experience. And so if and when there's ever a question of it, the risk is that as white people, we get offended. I'm sure mostly white women sitting there listening to this speech at the Ladies Anti-Slavery Society, even though they were anti-slavery, I'm sure some of his words chapped them pretty well, because this speech chips away at some of the fundamental mythologies about this country, all of which are white-centered. And for us to reform this country, or to perfect the union of this country, we have to be willing to untangle and deconstruct some of those myths, and to tell a more fuller truth. I'm looking at some of your questions. Do we have a record of how the talk was experienced by the audience when they first heard it? And then how did he get free? I'm not sure on all the details of how he got free. I have some of them, but I don't have them committed enough to memory to tell them to you without making a mistake. So it's easily Googled. Just Google it and you'll find out. His talk was experienced the way that many of such speeches are experienced today. Those who were already abolitionists and anti-slavery loved it. Those who were pro-slavery hated it and thought he was demonic, thought he was uppity. And there was a growing sensibility that slavery was wrong. So to that extent, his particular speech and narratives had extra credibility because he used to be a slave. And he could stand there and give a speech like this, which is very erudite. This is a powerful speech. It is a masterful speech. And even some abolitionists, even some who thought that slavery should be outlawed, that it was wrong, still viewed Black people as a little bit less than white people. Not as smart, not as capable, not as intelligent. And so here he stands and he gives this incredible speech. And it's almost like, I dare you to say I'm not intelligent. I dare you to say I'm not a human being at the same level as you are. Go ahead, say it. So what we know is that it seems from his letters, from his history, that his very person who gave speeches like this, who had the career that he had, shifted some people's minds about what a Black man could be. And all right, we're running out of time here, which is always the case. Some very powerful passages. There's one here on page 8 of this printout. This is sort of the, it's after he's quoting Isaiah from the rivers of Babylon. The next paragraph, it begins, fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy. It's that paragraph, if you are following along. He says, above that celebration, I hear the cries of the slaves, of millions. I hear the chains, the bleeding children. He goes on and on. My subject then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. And he puts that in all caps. I shall see this day and its popular characteristics from the slave's point of view. Standing there, identified with the American bondman, making his wrongs mine, I do not hesitate to declare with all my soul that the character and conduct of this nation never looked blacker to me than on this 4th of July. Whether we turn to the declarations of the past or to the professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. Standing with God and the crushed and bleeding slave on this occasion, I will, in the name of humanity, which is outraged, in the name of liberty, which is fettered, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible, which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call in question and to denounce with all the emphasis I can command everything that serves to perpetuate slavery, the great sin and shame of America. So Colin Kaepernick ain't got nothing on this. We see this played out. We see when a Black man stands up and says stuff like this about the United States of America, huge chunks of white America eat their liver out about it. Their spleen explodes. What's happening there? The fundamental white-centered myths of America are being chipped at. The comfort-producing, white supremacy-supporting myths of America are being challenged. This speech challenges it. Dr. King's speeches challenge it. Nelson Mandela's speeches in South Africa challenged it. Angela Davis's speeches in the 60s, Stokely Carmichael, their speeches challenged it. Malcolm X's challenged it. Colin Kaepernick kneeling challenges it. These are white-centered mythologies that he is challenging here. Some of you read this, some of you sent me texts and emails, you're like, oh my God, because you read through this and you see this powerful critique of the United States. I mean, he does not mince words. It's hard to read if you're firmly, comfortably ensconced in the comfortable narratives about this country. Yes, Cindy, Ta-Nehisi Coates, if you read his work, you'll be shaken. You will be shaken if you're a white person living inside these sort of comfortable places. So quickly, he's talking about, he says, look, at a certain point, so after this passage where he says, this is the great sin and shame of America, in the next paragraph, but I imagine, I fancy, I hear someone of my audience say, it's just in this circumstance that you and your brother abolitionists fail to make a favorable impression of the public mind. If you would argue more, defend more and denounce less, would you persuade more and rebuke less, your cause would be much more likely to succeed. In other words, if you just weren't so angry, if you could just speak rationally and be reasonable and just be a little more polite about it, we could understand your position better. This is infuriating. To people experiencing oppression, when they explain that oppression, when that oppression is out there for everyone to see, and people say, well, I see, but if you could just be more polite about it. If that oppression is eclipsed by how impolite people are being, that proves their point. That's illustrative, that the oppression, that we are blind to it, that we don't even really see it because we're so focused on whether or not they're being civil. This is a form of tone policing. I agree with what you're saying, but just the way you're saying it, your tone is so, he says, but I submit where all is plain, there's nothing to be argued. In other words, he goes on for several pages. What do you want me to argue? What do you want me to demonstrate to you? That Black people are human? You already think that. Even slaveholders think that. If they didn't think that, they wouldn't have 150 laws on the books about all the things we can and cannot do. Laws about for white people who teach us to read and write, they have to go to jail. It's against the law for Black people to do this. It's against all these laws. You only make those laws because you see us as human. You see us as moral agents who are able to, with will, choose or not choose certain actions. If you considered us animals, truly, the way you treat us, you wouldn't have laws. Do you have laws in the books for how cows and horses and pigs should act? No, you have laws in the books for how humans should act. So even though your laws allow you to own us as if we were animals, you do deeply know that we are not animals, we are human. So what do I need to argue? Do I need to convince you that we're human? You already know that. Do I need to convince you that that liberty is a value? This is the 4th of July. We're celebrating that. There is no man, there is no person in this room who thinks that slavery is the proper condition for them. Everyone knows that liberty is the proper condition for human beings. You want me to argue that and demonstrate that to you? That's ridiculous. I'm not going to argue that. Do you want me to argue that what is it? There's no argument to be made. If you don't get it, nothing I'm going to say is going to get it for you. Some things aren't to be argued for anymore. They're just plain. They're plain as day. They're plainly wrong. And you either get it or you don't at a certain point. Some things aren't to be argued anymore. They're just plainly there and wrong, and everyone knows it. So he's not going to spend any time really doing that. He mentions the Fugitive Slave Act, that basically it remains no longer a mere state institution, but he says, but now is an institution on the whole United States. He says, the right of the hunter to his prey stands superior to the right of marriage and to all rights in this republic, the rights of God included. For Black men, there is neither law, justice, humanity, not religion. The fugitive slave law makes mercy to them a crime and bribes the judge who tries them. He finishes that paragraph. Let this damning fact be perpetually told. Let it be thundered around the world that in tyrant killing, king hating, people loving, democratic, Christian America, the seats of justice are filled with judges who hold their offices under an open and palpable bribe and are bound in deciding the case of a man's liberty. They hear only his accusers. He gives history there of the so-called courts where fugitive slaves and other Black people are allowed to present their case. They're not allowed to present their case. The whole justice system was rigged against them and still is to a large extent. For the Black man, there's neither law, justice, humanity, nor religion. I remember the first time I heard a Black activist give a speech. This was 20 years ago at Rice University, and say, this was right after 9/11. And when a lot of, we were all after 9/11 and there was this focus on terrorism. And you saw people being really scared that the terrorists were going to bomb us. And, there's a lot of fear and everybody's buying Humvees, so the terrorists won't kill it. And I heard a Black activist say, a lot of y'all are acting like, this is your first experience of terrorism. You feel vulnerable now because the terrorists. But if you're Black in America, your experience has been terrorism all along. We have never been able to count on the law of the land and the officials of that law, whether it's police officers or judges or courts. We've never been able to assume that they were on our side. We never have been able to assume that they would work for us. They mostly don't. So we've lived in a state of terrorism, and particularly during Jim Crow, when you could be Emmett Till, a teenager on the street, and if a white woman accuses you of whistling at her or flirting with her or something, you're going to end up beaten and maimed and thrown into the river. You're going to end up lynched. You're going to end up with your fingers cut off, burned, tarred. That's terrorism, where at any moment, violence can break out against you. Violence can come to you, and you have no way of knowing when it can happen. And there's no guarantee that there's a legal recourse for you. So this is what he's not using the term terrorism because that hasn't come into the lexicon yet in this space, but that's the experience that he's explaining here. And that's why the country's not for them. This is not a country for them. The country, in fact, was not built for them. It was built by them, by their free labor. The White House, the Capitol building, was built by slaves. This country's founding wealth was built by slaves, but it wasn't built for them. It was built for white people. He gets even stronger. He critiques religion. The last several pages of the speech is him critiquing Christianity, We know that there were some Christian denominations who were very active in the abolitionist movement. The Quakers, for example, a few others from different denominations, a few Methodists here and there, a few Episcopalians here and there, Presbyterians. He mentions the name by name, several ministers that are there at the event, that he says they are exceptions to this. But on the whole, he, in this speech, critiques Christianity for not only being tolerant of slavery and of slaveholding, but of being complicit in it, that it is the guarantor of it. That if the churches, if the Christian churches together would come together and denounce slavery, it wouldn't last another day in this country because of the cultural power of the church, the cultural power of the Christian church, that nothing can really exist for very long in this country without the church behind it. And so the fact that slavery still exists is because huge chunks of the Christian church still support it. He says, well, he says a lot of things. A worship that can be conducted by persons who refuse to give shelter to the houseless, to give bread to the hungry, clothing to the naked, and who enjoin obedience to a law forbidding these acts of mercy is a curse, not a blessing to mankind. The Bible addresses all such persons as scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, who pay the tithe of mint, anise, and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of law, judgment, mercy, and faith. Here he is, he's aligning himself in the great prophetic tradition of Amos and Joel and the Hebrew prophets, and even of Jesus, who comes along in the Christian New Testament. He says, for my part, welcome infidelity, welcome atheism, welcome anything in preference to the gospel as preached like this. Atheism is better than this. He says, the American church, after he says your hands are full of blood, the American church is guilty when viewed in connection with what it's doing to uphold slavery. Let the religious press, the pulpit, the Sunday school, the conference meeting, the great ecclesiastical, missionary, Bible, and tract associations of the land, let them array their immense powers against slavery and slaveholding, and the whole system of crime and blood would be scattered to the winds. And that they do not do this involves them in the most awful responsibility of which the mind can conceive. So it's a strident critique of religion. He ends, and we're almost done. Before he ends with this long poem, there's a very important and famous image, probably the most famous image in the speech is the image of the reptile at the bosom of the country. And I'll read this whole paragraph. Fellow citizens, I will not enlarge further on your national inconsistencies. The existence of slavery in this country brands your republicanism as a sham, your humanity as a base pretense, and your Christianity as a lie. It destroys your moral power abroad. It corrupts your politicians at home. It saps the foundation of religion. It makes your name a hissing and a byword to a mocking earth. It is the antagonistic force in your government, the only thing that seriously disturbs and endangers your union. It fetters your progress. It is the enemy of improvement, the deadly foe of education. It fosters pride. It breeds insolence. It promotes vice. It shelters crime. It is a curse to the earth that supports it. And yet you cling to it as if it were the sheet anchor of all your hopes. Oh, be warned. Be warned. A horrible reptile is coiled up in your nation's bosom. The venomous creature is nursing at the tender breast of your youthful republic. For the love of God, tear away and fling from you the hideous monster, and let the weight of 20 million crush and destroy it. forever. So that's how he ends. There's a reptile coiled at the heart of the country. And it seems historically that he's correct. This is still, we are still in convulsions over this. Yes, we outlawed slavery, but it morphed. The systemic racism that is baked in to the bread of this country shapeshifts. When the form of slavery was outlawed, it took a different form. It took Jim Crow. Then it takes redlining. Then it takes the war on drugs. The racist nature of the war on drugs, where if you're poor and you buy crack cocaine, which statistically that means mostly black people, black and brown, you get 3 times the jail sentence as if you use the powdered cocaine. So it depends on what kind of cocaine you use. Crack sentences are way harsher than cocaine. So if you're a white rich guy on Wall Street snorting coke before you go manage your hedge fund, you'll get some community service on the weekends. But if you're a black guy trying to work, trying to make a life in in some redlined area of the city where you're forced to live and where your parents and grandparents were forced to live, and you buy crack cocaine off the corner, you're doing 30 years. I know because I used to teach in the Texas State Prison for about 6 years, and most of the guys in there were in there for drug-related offenses, and they were serving 20, 25, and 30-year sentences for crack cocaine, and they were all black. White guys that were in there for about 3 years for cocaine, powder. War on drugs, the prison industrial complex, the school to prison pipeline. All this stuff takes different forms. But the systemic racism is still there. The reptile is still at the bosom of our country. Douglass is optimistic. He ends this by saying, I still have hope. I believe we're a young country. This is a young country. We can still turn it around. Today in 2020, we're not as young. We're older. We've got old patterns. We've got deeper grooves. So it'll be harder for us to come out of them. And we may not ever come out of them. But we certainly won't if we don't try and if we don't throw our shoulder into it and try to make a difference. And so for me, reading work like this, availing myself of different narratives, narratives from Black people, from Indigenous people, from people of color, it helps fill out my understanding of this country. And it helps put my own experience of this country and my own perspective about it into a context. That it's not the universal experience. And that how I'm treated by the police is not how everyone else is treated by the police. And how I experience this country with its freedom and its opportunity and its prosperity and all that is absolutely not how other people, particularly people who are not white, experience this country. And it's hard. And yet it's something that we have to do. And the fact that we haven't had to think about these things is, as white people, is indicative of our privilege. And I know that term white privilege is a problematic term for a lot of people, and that a lot of white people react against it. And what it simply means is not that we haven't struggled, not that we haven't had our own struggles in our life and been poor or whatever, had to work and had to scrape. And it doesn't mean that we haven't had to struggle. It means we haven't had to struggle because of our race. We might have had struggles, but it wasn't because of our race. I saw a meme the other day. I put it on my Facebook page. If the Supreme Court hasn't had to decide whether or not you enjoy the same rights as other people, you probably have privilege. It's an interesting perspective. So, okay. So this is Frederick Douglass. It's a wonderful speech. It's a wonderful speech. It's a powerful speech. It's a confronting speech. And I believe if we take the message to heart, it gets us closer to the true ideals of this country and to the deep values of this national experiment. So we will continue this conversation in a couple of weeks on August the 11th with Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, which I put that up at the level of the Gettysburg Address. It is one of the most important and powerful pieces of American writing. It is stunning. It is a staggeringly beautiful and powerful letter. So I'm excited for you to read it. I sent the Women's Institute links to it, but you can find it all over the internet. Just make sure you don't get an abridged version. Get the full version. You can even get it in PDF form the way he typed it with that old typewriter. So take a look at that, and we will pick up. You will see some of the same themes as we saw today in this speech. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for being in this class. I've enjoyed it with you. Thank you to Mary Lee and to Jim Wallace for underwriting this. The Dr. King class will also be free, so go tell your friends, and I'll see you all in a couple of weeks. Thanks for being here.